The issue of the individual in the state concerns the nature of freedom, and really there's the issue of how much freedom is to be accorded to the individual as opposed to the state. That at least is the way that it's conceived in classical liberalism, of which, as we'll see, John Stuart Mill, an English philosopher, is one of the prime examples of that tradition. Now there's also another way of thinking which sees different sorts of threats to individual freedom. And as we'll see in the work of Karl Marx, there is in fact a way of thinking about the economy as in fact the source of a threat to freedom and a constraint on individual freedom. So as Marx sees it, the economy is not, as classical liberals like Mill and others try to portray it, simply a realm in which individuals can pursue whatever goals they want to pursue. For Marx, the economy, the economic system, is a sphere in which we are under the power of the system as a whole, and through the system, particular people within the system. Marx calls them capitalists, who have power and authority within that system. So when we look at the issue of the individual and state, we're trying to get a sense of where the boundary lies in terms of individual freedom, and whether individual freedom means giving individuals more power to define themselves in relation to the state, or whether it, in fact, actually a very strong state is necessary to take away the threat to freedom that exists in the exercise of economic power, which is, of course, the way that Marx looks at it. So let's take a look at these two thinkers then, John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx, and along the way we'll try to get a better idea of this question and this debate and the issue of the relations of the individual and the state. Now, classical liberalism emphasizes the idea of the freedom of the individual from government interference and the rights of the individual to pursue his or her own legitimate interests. So this idea is that we are free when we are not being constrained or coerced by government. And insofar as we are not being coerced, insofar as we decide what life plan to pursue, what career to go into, that sort of thing, as long as we're not being constrained from government sources, as long as there is no government interference, then we are free, according to the liberal tradition. We just have to be careful here that we don't confuse this tradition with the stance of people who call themselves liberals and who are identified as liberals as opposed to conservatives today. It's not exactly the same thing. Classical liberalism would in fact be endorsed by both liberals and conservatives in the terms that we use those, in the way that we use those terms in political discourse. So we don't want to make that mistake. Classical liberalism is a tradition that puts emphasis on the freedom of the individual, freedom from government interference. And that's one of the main places where it locates the dangers to individual freedom, when government becomes too powerful and legislates in individuals' lives. There are, of course, differences between liberals like Mill and more conservative positions, of course, because Mill, as we'll see, is very keen and puts a lot of emphasis on freedom of lifestyle, and that, of course, is something that does in many ways conflict with a conservative attitude to social issues. So for the classical liberal tradition, then we can say the idea is to protect individual freedom, and it has a somewhat not exactly a weak, but not a very substantive, not a very powerful idea of a common good. In other words, for classical liberals generally, insofar as we're pursuing our own self-interest, that's how a greater common good is created. So the idea of individuals actually acting for the motivation of serving the common good would be an illusory thing for liberalism. That doesn't happen, and in fact it shouldn't happen. As liberals see it, the best way to ensure everybody's happiness is for everybody to act in terms of their own perceived legitimate interests, and thereby a greater good will develop, thereby than if government tries to legislate a common good. And that, of course, is the basis of the theory of Adam Smith, one of the founders of liberal economics. Now, John Stuart Mill, who was writing in the middle of the 18th century in England, a couple of centuries, actually, yeah, not a couple of centuries, but at any rate, a good half century after Adam Smith. Mill argued that in a democracy there is a new sort of danger to individual freedom, and aside from government interference, that is, in modern democracies there's a new danger that develops for Mill, and he calls this danger the tyranny of the majority. And so what he's going to argue is that we need some protection from the power of the majority to assert its will and to assert its opinion on matters of culture and on matters of social issues. So this is a new danger to freedom. And Mill is writing, let's recall, in the middle of the 19th century. And one thing that is characteristic of what's going on at this time is an increasing integration of society. And we have to try and look back here and imagine what it was like when this integration was taking place. Remember, only when Mill is writing on liberty and his other major writings, only less than half a century after the effects of the Industrial Revolution and the sort of, the end of agriculture as the main form of production. And so that there were really widespread, really stark and revolutionary changes in the nature of society. And one of the key characteristics that Mill picks up on is an increasing integration of society. And what this means we can think of in these terms. We see through transportation an increasing sort of integration of society in terms of people's ability to move from place to place. Again, this is commonplace to us now, but if we try to imagine a time when it just wasn't possible to traverse large distances like this in a short space of time, think of how much more separate people would have been, and think of how much more differentiated different communities and subgroups would have been. One thing that happens with transportation and the increasing integration that provides is an increasing familiarity with different parts of a nation, of a country. And Mill is writing about England, which is already a pretty small country. Unified by the railroad, it becomes a really small country, not difficult to traverse those distances at all. So here's an increasing interaction of different communities, and that produces uniformity. According to Mill, it produces an increasing integration of morals, of ideas, and opinions. And of course, the growth of national press is another thing that's key. And again, this is something we're very familiar with, these newspapers that have a huge circulation. But in Mill's time, this was a completely new thing, that production could be such that you could sell copies of these throughout the country instantaneously. And what happens when people read the same newspapers? People imbibe the same opinions. People take on board the same opinions. The same opinions and ideas begin to circulate across the nation as a whole, across the country as a whole. And as a result, those opinions take on a new force. There ceases to be any sort of way of being protected, of being isolated from these ideas. They're now dominant ideas. So the press has a role in perpetuating and producing these ideas that then become shared, then become common currency for everybody. And of course, not to forget popular manners, fashion, dress, and that sort of thing. And again, this is all about the increasing integration. So people are increasingly developing more nationwide styles of doing things, from lifestyles, from dress styles to music and tastes. Everything is becoming larger scale and more uniform. And these are the conditions, the increasing integration of society, that gives rise to the danger that Mill calls the tyranny of the majority. In other words, to stand out, to be different, to not to follow the crowd, but to be an individual with one's own opinions becomes harder and harder as this process of integration takes place. It's increasingly difficult to stake out a space where you can be somebody who thinks differently and who acts differently, according to Mill. Those sort of isolated communities disappear, and now it's much harder to avoid this pressure to be like everybody else, to have the same opinions, to look the same way and dress the same way as everybody else. So that's what Mill sees at the middle of the 19th century, and that's what he's going to write about. Now, the most important part of his essay on liberty, which is dealing with these issues that we've been talking about, the most important part is really, it's at the beginning of the piece, and it's come to be known as the harm principle. And it's stated in the text, it's page 589, it's stated it in this way, which seems to be, and Mill always writes like this, it seems to be very clear, but again, if you scratch the surface a little bit, problems and issues start to emerge. So here's the thing, and this is the harm principle. The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. So here's the thing, the only occasion when society has a justification, a right to be concerned with our behavior, not necessarily to prohibit it, but to be concerned about it, is when that behavior touches on other people, is when it concerns others, as Mill puts it. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. So, if our behavior is only of concern to ourselves, if it's not harming anybody else, we have an absolute right to do as we please. So that's the harm principle, and this is the principle that Mill articulates as the line in the sand between the area of conduct where individuals are free and the area where government interference is legitimate. So let's have a look more closely. Government has a legitimate interest in controlling your behavior, Mill tells us, under only two conditions. The first is that when such an interference, as we said, will prevent harm to other people. So to prevent harm to other people is a major condition. There's also another condition which Mill does talk about later in the text, and he talks about the need to help other people, help society or another person. For example, something like jury duty. And their society has a legitimate interest in making us do things. A further interest, of course, could be conscription in the military. So there are cases where society has an interest in our behavior and has a right to demand things of us. And that Mill doesn't want to question with that. He wants to leave that open. The main thing is really about lifestyles and our thoughts and opinions and how we act on those thoughts and opinions. And that's where he wants to draw a line in the sand. Okay, so let's take a look at the two main parts of individual liberty that exist for Mill, the two main areas into which he divides the idea of individual liberty. Now, the first is liberty of thought and expression. And of course, this includes things like religious belief. It includes our right to articulate our own religious beliefs and hold them as we please. And of course, this is something we're very familiar with in a society that is founded on the separation of church and state, or that holds that as part of its constitutional heritage, the United States, although there is always conflict about that, of course, but this idea, I think, is pretty familiar to us: the individual's right to choose his or her own beliefs about salvation. And of course, the right to articulate those beliefs, the right to express one's opinions freely, whether you do that in a public forum, in a newspaper, nowadays, of course, on the internet. That liberty to express ourselves, to express our thoughts as we please, again, Mill gives a very wide scope for the individual's right to express their opinions, to make their beliefs known in that way. And of course, letter writing, writing books, setting one's ideas down on paper, all of these things are part of liberty and thought and expression, and all of them are protected then by the first principle, according to Mill. Now let's take a look at the reasons Mill gives for why this freedom of thought and expression is valuable. And I think this is really of most interest to us, as we're very familiar with these freedoms and the idea of freedom of thought and expression, at least as a constitutional principle. And again, some people debate about whether these are actually adhered to fully, but those things we can definitely talk about, and there is disagreement here. But there are grounds for saying that Mill wants us to take these freedoms seriously, I think, and we can argue. We'll talk about the Patriot Act in a moment, where we'll sort of look at a contemporary example of how this conflict might apply. So let's take a look at Mill's reasons, and I think these are important ones, as we don't usually dig down to the reasons for our adherence to this belief. Now, the first thing is that the unpopular idea that is expressed may end up being true, and this is an argument based on fallibility. And of course, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense historically, in the sense that we've often been wrong. Societies have often been wrong about things that they believed 100% to be true. Copernicus, for example, the first person really to propose as a serious theoretical principle that the sun was in fact, the Earth was not the center of our galaxy, but in fact the Earth revolved around the sun, and he had precise measurements to prove this idea. This idea at the time, of course, was very unpopular, and later there was a huge conflict with Galileo, who learnt a lot from Copernicus and the Church. A lot of our central beliefs may, in fact, turn out to be false, and that's what Mill wants us to bear in mind here. That we may be, as a society, very convinced of something, but we've still got to let the unpopular idea be expressed, because that idea may turn out to be true, and if we suppress it now, we're going to prevent ourselves from ever finding out the truth. Now, the second idea is that a wrong opinion or belief should be aired so that we know why it is wrong, so that the outlines of the true opinion can be seen more clearly. This is a little bit more complicated. I think the essential idea here is that we don't really know the truth unless we know how it's different from wrong opinions. In other words, until we can look at a wrong opinion and say why it's wrong. So knowing that something is true is more than just being able to recite a set of sentences or a set of statements. It's also knowing why it's true. And understanding why something is true is inseparable from understanding why other things are wrong, and being able to debate and being able to prove that the true opinion is in fact true. It makes the contours of that true opinion clear. And I think this is a very profound and important point that Mill is making. It's a very strong argument for why it in fact, even if an opinion is wrong, we should let it be aired. So even when ideas are false, and this one picks up on the second point, even when ideas are false, dissenters from the accepted opinions prevent intellectual stagnation and force us to articulate reasons and re-examine the reasons for our convictions. So it's actually good for us to be challenged intellectually, even though our opinion may in fact be true. Even if that were the case, it's still good for us to be challenged intellectually and have to articulate why we believe things. By doing that, we make our belief stronger, and we also increase our knowledge of why it's true. So open debate is always a good thing. It's always positive and productive for finding out the truth or finding out more about why something is true. Now, perhaps a contemporary example of this might be the debate over intelligent design, which we looked at briefly when we talked about philosophy of religion. And this was there was a trial not too long ago in Pennsylvania with the school board, where eventually it was the decision to teach intelligent design and evolution was thrown out by the court. However, if we ask ourselves, well, how would Mill think about this debate between intelligent design and Darwinism? And if we look at his principles on individual freedom here, interestingly, we might say that although we could very well debate about whether it's right to teach it in schools, and certainly not as an alternative to evolution, which it hasn't yet proved itself to be, but at least have the debate between intelligent design and evolution at some level is probably a good thing for evolutionary theory, because it shows that theory what it has to respond to, and it forces it to articulate its own grounds. And when a theory becomes so dominant that it no longer has any competitors, according to Mill's ideas, that may not be such a good thing. In other words, we always want disagreements, and we always want different opinions, and that is always a productive thing, because it always forces us to think more deeply about our reasons for why we hold things, our reasons why we believe things. So this may be a good contemporary example to use to think about what Mill is talking about. Now, the only significant restriction of free speech for Mill is the clear and present danger exception. Clear and present danger is the term given to it by the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. And Mill's example is corn dealers are starvers of the poor. If you utter that sentence with an angry crowd present, and of course corn dealers somewhere in the background, then your speech is likely to create a clear and present danger of serious harm. Another example used in this respect is shouting fire in a crowded theater. That again is speech which is not protected because it falls prey to the clear and present danger clause. So, those kind of things which are incitement or which lead to a clear and present danger, clear and present likelihood of harm, those sorts of speech are not protected. Now, the second big area, aside from liberty of thought and discussion, is liberty of tastes and pursuit of one's own style of life. This argument is again based on the importance of personal autonomy in Mill's account, as opposed to thought and liberty of thinking and expression. Here we're thinking about liberty of action and the individual's right to live their life as they see fit. Now, one problem here, which we talked about in the harm principle, or which came up in the harm principle and we're going to talk about here, is the idea there that an action is to be rolled out if it's an action that concerns others, or becomes liable to be rolled out if it's an action that concerns others. The problem is, how do we determine when an action concerns other people? And how do we determine when it is just an action that only concerns oneself? Let's take a look at some examples from the thought experiments on page 594. Let's take the first example. Barlow refuses to wear a safety helmet when he rides his bicycle. Well, yeah, it looks like the sort of thing that Mill would definitely want to protect, and in fact it is. These kind of laws, and we have a similar one, of course, the seatbelt law, which tells us that you have to wear a seatbelt when you're in a car. Those things are what are called paternalistic laws, in the sense that they're designed to protect the individual and stop the individual from making decisions that might be contrary to their interest. They're called paternalistic because it assumes that somebody, the state, knows better than the individual what is in their interest. And in fact, the whole idea of a seatbelt law presumes exactly that individuals make poor decisions about their own safety, so therefore we need laws to mandate that they wear seatbelts. It's not for anybody else's protection, it's for the person themselves who gets behind a wheel. And of course safety helmets are the same thing. So this is a principle which would be one that very clearly falls within Mill's scope, but does it just concern the person? It seems to. Of course you could raise the issue of, well, it's not just Barlow, but of course, if he gets injured, other people are likely to be affected. His parents won't be very happy. If he has kids, they're definitely going to be left in a lurch. So, do we have to take account of that? Mill would want to say, no, we don't in this case. This is a case where we just have to focus on the person, and here we have to separate what concerns somebody else from this case, which just concerns the person themselves. Now, how about number 4? Lucy is in pain from a terminal disease and requests the services of a physician to help her commit suicide. Again, this seems like the kind of principle that Mill would definitely want to protect, our right to make these kind of decisions about our lives, and of course about the right to end our life. Now, of course, aside from moral objections here or religious objections, again, you could point to the possible effect on others who are, Lucy's loved ones. Perhaps what will be the effect on them? Surely the action concerns them to some degree. And of course, like we said, there are the religious moral objections to ending of a human life as such. So again, Mill wants us to make this distinction, but it's you could argue around the margins about whether we can actually separate actions that concern others from actions that concern only the person themselves. Harriet, number 7, is a single woman who spends most of her paycheck on gambling and often does not have enough money to buy food or the medicine she herself needs. Well, if she's a single woman, presumably she doesn't have any dependents, so this is not a great thing to do. But perhaps that's just Harriet's exercise of her own freedom. Again, that would seem to be Mill's position on this one. Perhaps number 8 is different. Brad, a single father, spends most of his paycheck on gambling and often does not have enough money to provide food or medicine for his children. Here, again, you might want to step in and say that there is a difference here, and I think Mill would want to endorse the difference between 7 and 8 here. A father who spends his paycheck on gambling is, of course, not just endangering himself, but his kids too. So this seems like the kind of action that we would have to say does in fact concern others and becomes liable to intervention by the government to stop this kind of thing. So that would be the unprotected sphere. Number 8 would come into the unprotected sphere where what we're doing concerns others. Is there a trade-off between liberty and security then? A lot of people who argue for certain measures that might be employed to protect security, and of course an excellent recent example is the USA Patriot Act, which does extend the powers of government to wiretap and to get private records such as medical records, library records, and all kinds of records to pursue ongoing terrorist investigations. Some people argue, well, that kind of thing, we need to make this trade-off. If we want to be secure, then we have to give up a certain amount of potential freedom, of potential liberty from scrutiny. So that's one perspective, that these two are in a constant trade-off. Benjamin Franklin very much thought differently on this, and said, those who sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither. In other words, it's not a trade-off at all, that it's actually a kind of slippery slope to attempt to give up some amount of liberty for security. Once we start doing that, it becomes self-perpetuating, and we just end up giving up even more liberty, and it's not clear that it's not clear what the point of security is in that case, if we're having to give up so much of what makes life valuable in order to secure it. So there are two very different perspectives here, and I think Mill and the liberal tradition that's associated with him come down very definitely on protecting individual freedom as against the right of government interference. Alright, now let's move on to a different character entirely, Karl Marx. Again, somebody like Mill, who was writing in the early 19th century, earlier than Mill, in fact. His main texts were sort of mid-century as well, but he did start somewhat earlier. And his main idea, which we're going to talk about, is the priority of economics. We want to be aware when we think about Marx that we give a good account of his role of the idea of the economic system as the dominant thing. And that's very important for Marx's view of how capitalism, in fact, endangers human freedom. It's always difficult because we're so familiar with sort of societies that have been identified with Marx, whether they be Cuba, Soviet Russia, and Eastern European countries, and we don't want to necessarily prejudice Marx's thinking when we come to it by identifying it with those sort of societies. The 20th century communist societies were indebted to a certain style of thinking identified with Marx, but it's very important that we try and take Marx's theory as it stands and not identify it with certain sort of failed societies that may not in fact have been very faithful to Marx's writings anyway. So let's try and get into this idea of Marx's view of economics as a sphere of exploitation, and we'll try and draw out what kind of view of individual freedom that leaves us with. The basic idea here about the priority of economics, not economics as a sort of discipline, but about economics as in the sphere in which we produce things. Most of us are familiar with it as the sphere in which we work for a living. All of us are in the economic realm insofar as we work for a living. So it's how we produce things, or how a society produces things. And in Marx's day, this was mainly production and as industrial production. In our day, of course, it's much more diversified, much more technological, and also the service sector has just become much bigger than it ever was in Marx's day. And Marx is writing, again like Miller, at a time of enormous social change, just after the Industrial Revolution and the development of a huge mass of people living in cities, and in fact living in squalor because the resources and the infrastructure just hadn't been developed to support them. So Marx sees this all over Europe, this development, the move away from the countryside to the cities to find work. People sort of massed together in these institutions, in these cities, I should say, where there is no regulation really about how they are treated. So they work 12-hour days. They barely have enough to eat, and Marx is very taken by this, very affected by this situation and what he sees around him. So the idea of the economic structure, let's just get at this idea, is centered on an idea of a distinction between base and superstructure. The economic structure is the base, and the base determines all other sorts of social institutions, including things like politics, religion, the media, and all of those things. Now, the key thing here is this: if you know what the economic structure is like, those other things, politics, religion, follow from that economic structure. So there will be a politics of capitalism, there will be a religion and a media unique to capitalism. But those things don't have any importance on their own. Those things are part of a superstructure. So if we want to understand society, if we want to understand how it changes, if we want to understand the important cog that makes everything else turn, we have to understand the economic system. So here's the basic idea. The base. The base is what shapes the superstructure. So whatever the base is like, everything else will be built up on top of that depending on what's in the base. And that is composed of two distinct components. There are the means of production and the relations of production. The means of production are simply all the things you need to produce things, whether machines, factories, land, raw materials, etc. And of course, all of those things are owned by the bourgeoisie, by capitalists. Those means of production, however, you can't use them unless you put them into certain relations. And those relations of production in capitalism are the relations between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So you have to put them into relations before you can actually use them. Now, from that base of economic relations, everything else follows, according to Marx. Everything else is superficial. There's an education system, there's religion, there's family, there's politics, there's mass media, but those things don't have any effect or influence on how society changes or develops. Those things are all just effects of the base, all just effects of the system of production. So in the system, religion will play a sort of ideological role in sort of consoling people to their fates within the relations of production. The family will have a role based on, again, its role in producing individuals who enter the system of production. Politics will be very superficial and will again be unable to affect the basic economic relations of society. And the mass media will, of course, echo the ideas of the governing class in capitalism, the bourgeoisie, or the capitalists. So this is the basic thing, the difference between the base, where everything happens, and the superstructure, which is really superficial and not relevant to explaining how society changes. And how societies change, according to Marx, in history is a history of class struggle. And the classes are, of course, identified as those different relations of production. So different societies in history are defined by the nature of the classes that compose them. And that means they're defined by the different relations of production. So class is defined by one's position in the system of production. Capitalism has two major classes, the bourgeoisie or the capitalists and the proletariat, the workers. And again, they're defined not by rich and poor. It's much more specific than that, much more scientific. The bourgeoisie are the owners of the means of production. In other words, they own privately those means of production that can be used to produce things that can be sold. The factories, the goods, the equipment, the transportation. Anybody who makes money by owning means of production is a bourgeois or a capitalist. It's not a derogatory term, it's simply an identification of your role in the system of production. Anybody who doesn't have any means of production but has to sell their labor in order to survive, the vast majority of people in Marx's time, those people are the proletariat. They're identified as the proletariat. And indeed the vast majority in any capitalist society. Now, what's important is to understand the nature of capitalism as a system. Marx doesn't want to say that capitalists are greedy or immoral. In other words, it's not a moral critique of capitalists. He's not saying capitalists are just nasty and if they were nicer, everything would be okay. What he's saying is that exploitation is just part of the way capitalism works as a system. As long as there is capitalism, the mass of people will be exploited. So, it's no good to simply criticize capitalists. It's no good to criticize certain companies or people for being immoral. So when, politicians get up and sort of denounce Enron for being exploitative and, they were very poorly managed, etc., etc., that's not Marx's approach to things at all. Marx thinks, the way specific companies operate, the way specific people in companies operate is irrelevant. It's just the nature of capitalism as a system that it compels companies to make certain decisions, and it compels a relation between workers and owners that rests on exploitation. So what is exploitation? Very simply, it means that the workers earn less in wage terms than the value they produce for the capitalist. The capitalist keeps the extra value produced by the worker as what Marx calls surplus labor. The surplus labor, the surplus value produced by the worker. So that is, in effect, free labor for the capitalist. They haven't paid the worker for it in wages, but of course they get to keep that excess and make profit on the excess labor of the worker. So there's a basic exploitation in terms of the way the system works. If we look at it as a pyramid, again, we can sort of identify different groups and different parts of the system. And of course, holding the whole thing up are workers who do all the work without any of the material reward. And of course, there's a sort of system of illusion for Marx, a system of compensation, which is the religious, the elements of the clergy or the religious institutions that con people into thinking that there will be starvation afterwards, so why bother to rebel in this life? And of course there's the armed forces, which are the armed wing of the capitalist class. So that the whole thing works as a sort of system for Marx. But to understand how everything works, what we have to understand is the way the underlying economic system operates. That's key to the whole thing. Now, the materialist theory of history, for Marx, changes in society are caused by a contradiction or a conflict between the forces and the relations of production. Remember, the forces of production are whatever you can use to produce things. Whatever you can use to produce things. The relations of production are the specific social relations into which people enter to become part of the economy. In capitalism, those relations are owners and workers. Okay? So it's a contradiction between these two things. Now let's just spell that out a bit more fully, because we need to understand what Marx means when he talks of a contradiction here. Now, let's think of the forces of production as they sort of go through history. And history is just one linear line of the increase of forces of production. So we start off with sort of very basic things. People till the soil. Eventually, we can harness animal power. Eventually, with coal and steam, we get much greater forces of production in the industrial age, increasing with the invention of chemical forms and electricity, and into the 20th century, the sort of technological, computer-driven revolution. But all of these things increase the forces of production. It never goes back. It never goes backwards. So throughout history, it's a continual increase in our ability to produce things, to produce quantities with the amount of production and effort that we have to put into it. Increasing forces of production. Now what happens is that as the forces of production grow, relations of production will intersect at specific stages, and those stages are the points of social revolution. So at a very primitive level of forces of production, we get less developed societies like slave-owning societies. And again, Marx's point is that the relations of production in this society, slaves and owners of slaves, that relation of production is determined by a certain level of the forces of production. As the forces continue to develop, slave-owning societies are just no longer viable. They just don't work anymore in relation to the amount that society is able to produce by changing relations of production. So let's assume that as things change, we get a shift, and again, it doesn't sort of map exactly as each society changes historically, but we get another level where we have feudal societies, where again things are organized according to ownership of land primarily, and people, serfs are identified with being associated with a particular lord working on a particular land. As the forces develop again, that land-based system of production is no longer optimal. It no longer uses the forces of production to their optimum as they continue to develop. And so at some point we get a transition to capitalism, which instead of being based on land and sort of identification through blood and birth, gives individuals formal freedom to enter into relations of production with private owners of capital, people who own factories and material and whatever else. Revolution in the nature of the relations of production, but again a result of the continual growth in the forces of production. Now, Marx believes that eventually, as capitalism develops, capitalism itself is going to become unsustainable, and we're going to have another transition to another type of society that Marx calls communism. Instead of being based on private ownership of the means of production, it will be based on what Marx calls common ownership of the means of production. So instead of having private owners who contract freely with people who must sell their labor for a living, communism is a transition to a kind of society where the means of production are not owned privately anymore, they're held in common. And Marx again sees that as a necessary outcome of the development in the forces of production. And one thing, 150 years after Marx came up with this theory, more than 150 years since he began to articulate this, it's, looking back, it's striking that the idea of capitalism as a very developmental system that really does revolutionize the forces of production, and very quickly, is true. However, of course, there's no sign of the necessary transition to another form of society. There may be, of course, there have been sort of great problems with capitalism, the sort of depression of the 1920s in the United States, other significant crashes and hardships elsewhere. However, we've not had a complete breakdown of the system as Marx predicted. And Marx does intend this as a prediction. He thinks that this is a sort of science of history. And that claim, at least thus far, hasn't been borne out. It's again, when we ask the question, what is communism, there's no better place than to look at what the Communist Manifesto says about it. This is from page 607 of the text. Well, we have a heavy progressive income tax, as we would expect, abolition of rights of inheritance, confiscation of property of immigrants and rebels, centralization of credit of the means of communication and transport, number 6, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. Number 8, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor. So you can see some of it is sort of revolutionary, some of it is sort of very practical and points towards the problems of society as Marx saw it at the time, the exploitation of child labor, the absence of education in particular, and the gross inequalities that Marx saw in capitalism. And again, one of the things that is often said is that the transition of capitalism in the 20th century, where through things like a welfare state and welfare provisions and public health care and these kinds of things, the rough edges were taken off the system so that it ceased to be the sort of capitalism red in tooth and claw, if you like, that it was for Marx. And by taking the rough edges off the system, it made the system more sustainable and, in fact, perhaps prevented the kind of revolutionary transformation that Marx wanted to see in capitalism. So these measures here are intended to take away what Marx sees as the exploitation and the lack of individual freedom in the economy. And only by interfering with the perceived freedom in capitalism to contract one's labor, and which Marx sees as, the freedom to exploit, only by interfering and preventing the economy from operating like that, Marx thinks, do we really have a chance of achieving any kind of freedom for individuals. So freedom is something that can only be achieved by, an active central authority intervening here, at least initially, and changing the operation of the economy so that it no longer operates as a danger to individuals' freedom and as a form of exploitation. So let's have some reflections then. So classical liberalism, as we saw, is concerned with the danger to individual freedom from government interference, as well for Mill as the power of majority opinion in areas of culture and lifestyle. Marx argues that, in fact, there is a far more powerful threat to individual freedom rooted in the economic system. So people will be unfree as long as capitalism is the mode in which we organize our economic life. So there's a complete disparity here in terms of how people conceive freedom. Freedom from government interference or freedom from others, or rather as brought about by using state power or some other means to remove the inherent exploitation and unfreedom that exists in the economic system. So these are two different models of the individual and the state. So have a think about which perspective you identify, and perhaps both perspectives have something important to say. And perhaps we want to be aware of them and think how you would, identify different political positions in public discourse today and put them more or less along this scheme here. They don't map completely on our existing sort of political divisions, if we think of those as sort of liberal and conservative. So there's an interesting cross-section here, but these theories are very powerful and tell us a lot about different models of individual freedom.